The fire in the center of the gathering ground was already burning too high, and Elena Voss felt the heat of it on her face long before she understood why her hands had started to shake. Hundreds of pack members stood in a wide circle around the flames, their eyes fixed on the raised platform where Alpha Marcus Kane stood in his ceremonial coat. Tonight was the night everyone had been waiting for. Tonight, Marcus would name the woman he had chosen to stand beside him as his mate and future alpha female. Elena stood near the front, close enough to see the small muscles in his jaw tighten as he looked out over the crowd, and far enough back that she told herself it did not matter how close she stood. She was not nervous. She kept telling herself that. She was not nervous, because there was nothing to be nervous about. Everyone in the pack, from the oldest elder to the youngest pup, expected her name to be the one he called. She had grown up 2 houses down from him. She had trained beside him in the fighting circle since she was 7 years old, had bled beside him during his first true hunt, had sat with him through the night his father died, and he became alpha at only 22. There had never been a formal declaration between them, no promise spoken aloud, but there had been years of quiet understanding, years of glances held a second too long, years of him choosing to sit beside her at gatherings when he could have sat anywhere else. The whole pack had watched that closeness grow, and the whole pack had drawn the same conclusion Elena had drawn. Tonight was simply a formality. Tonight was simply Marcus saying out loud what everyone already knew in their bones. The drums stopped. The fire crackled once, loud, like a small explosion of sparks rising into the dark sky. Marcus lifted his chin and looked out over the gathered pack, and for one heartbeat, his eyes found Elena's. She held her breath. She let herself smile, just slightly, just enough that if he was looking for her reassurance, he would find it. Then he looked away, and he spoke a name that was not hers. Sabrina Cole. The words hit Elena like a blow to the chest, and for a moment, she genuinely believed she had misheard him. She waited for him to correct himself, to laugh, to say it had been some kind of test. Instead, a young woman stepped out from the crowd on the far side of the fire, her golden hair braided with ribbons that marked her as a daughter of the Ashwood pack, one of the wealthiest and most politically connected packs in the region. Sabrina walked toward the platform with the calm, practiced grace of someone who had expected this outcome, someone who perhaps had known for weeks. The pack around Elena began to murmur, a low wave of surprise moving through the crowd, like wind through tall grass. Elena did not move. She could not move. Her body had gone completely still, the way prey goes still, in the moment before it understands it has already been caught. Marcus reached down and took Sabrina's hand in front of everyone, and the pack, trained since birth to accept the alpha's decisions without question, began to cheer. The sound of their approval rang in Elena's ears, like something distant and underwater. She watched Marcus smile at Sabrina, watched him lift their joined hands into the firelight, and she understood, in one terrible and complete moment, that this had not been a mistake. This had been a decision. He had chosen this. He had chosen her, over everyone he had grown up loving, and he had done it in front of the entire pack, without once looking back, to see how it would land on the girl who had believed she already had his heart. Elena felt eyes turning toward her. A few of the older women, the ones who had watched her and Marcus grow up together, were already glancing her way with expressions of quiet pity. She could not bear it. She forced her spine straight, forced her chin up, forced her mouth into the shape of a polite smile, because whatever else happened tonight, she refused to let this pack watch her fall apart. She clapped along with everyone else, 3 slow claps that felt like they took every ounce of strength she had left in her body, and then she stepped back through the crowd, weaving between bodies that did not seem to notice her leaving, her heart pounding so hard, she thought surely someone must hear it. She did not run. Running would have drawn attention, and attention was the one thing she could not survive right now. She walked, steady and calm on the outside, until she reached the edge of the trees where the firelight no longer touched her, and only then did she let her hands press against her mouth to keep the sound trapped inside her chest. She stood there in the dark for a long moment, breathing hard, listening to the celebration continue behind her, as if nothing in the world had just ended. Behind her, she heard footsteps, light and quick, and she turned to find her closest friend, a young woman named Dana Fenwick, hurrying toward her with worry written across her face. "Elena," Dana said quietly, glancing back over her shoulder toward the fire. I don't understand it. Everyone thought. Don't, Elena said, her voice steadier than she expected it to be. Please don't say what everyone thought. I already know what everyone thought. Dana reached out and took her hand, and for a moment, neither of them said anything at all. The forest around them was quiet, except for the distant sound of the celebration, laughter, and drums, and the low howl of pack members honoring their alpha's choice. Come stay with me tonight, Dana offered. You shouldn't be alone. Elena shook her head slowly. She looked back toward the fire one last time, toward the platform where Marcus still stood, with Sabrina's hand in his, both of them bathed in golden light, both of them looking every bit like the future the pack had been promised. Something inside Elena that had been soft and hopeful for years finally went hard and cold, and in its place came a clarity she had never felt before. I need to be alone, she said, just for tonight. Dana did not push. She squeezed Elena's hand once and let her go, though the worry did not leave her face. Elena turned and walked deeper into the trees, away from the fire, away from the sound of celebration, away from the life she had spent 24 years building, around the assumption that Marcus Kane would one day choose her. She did not decide to leave the pack that night in any single dramatic moment. The decision built itself slowly, step by step, as she walked through the dark forest that had raised her. She thought about waking up tomorrow morning and seeing Sabrina Cole in the Alpha's house, sitting at the table where Elena had shared 1,000 quiet breakfasts with Marcus over the years. She thought about the coming months of wedding preparations, the pack gathering again to celebrate a bond ceremony, everyone watching to see how Elena would react, waiting to see if she would embarrass herself with grief in public. She thought about growing old in this territory, watching Marcus and Sabrina raise pups together, watching their children grow into the next generation of pack leadership, while she remained the woman everyone remembered as the one who was almost chosen. She could not do it. She understood that with a certainty that frightened her, because leaving the pack was not a small thing. A lone wolf had no protection, no territory rights, no claim to shelter or hunting grounds. Packs did not simply tolerate lone wolves passing through their land. They saw them as threats, as potential thieves of resources, sometimes as spies for rival packs. A lone wolf without allies could expect to be challenged, driven off, or worse, by any territory she crossed. Elena had grown up hearing stories about wolves who left their packs and were never heard from again, and she had always assumed those stories were meant as warnings to keep young wolves obedient and afraid. Tonight, for the first time in her life, she understood why someone might choose that danger anyway. Staying meant living every day inside a wound that would never be allowed to heal. Leaving meant uncertainty, but uncertainty was not the same as impossibility. Elena had trained her whole life in hunting, in tracking, in fighting. She was not helpless. She was, she reminded herself as she walked, one of the strongest fighters her age in the entire pack, second only to Marcus himself in the sparring circle. If anyone could survive alone, it was her. She returned to her small house at the edge of the pack's residential grounds and sat on the edge of her bed for a long time, without lighting a single lamp. She listened to the celebration continue in the distance, the sound slowly softening as the night wore on, until eventually the fire must have burned down and the pack must have scattered to their beds, exhausted and satisfied with the future they believed had just been secured for them. When the territory finally fell silent, Elena rose from her bed and began to pack. She did not take much. She rolled a change of clothes, a hunting knife that had belonged to her mother, a small amount of dried meat, and a water skin into a tight bundle that she could carry easily in her jaws when she shifted to her wolf form. She left behind the dress she had worn to the ceremony, discarded on the floor like something already belonging to a different life. She left behind letters, trinkets, small carved animals that Marcus had given her as gifts over the years when they were children who did not yet understand what those gifts might come to mean. She left behind almost everything that connected her to the girl she had been that morning, the girl who had woken up certain that her future was already decided. Before she left the house, she paused at the small mirror hanging near her door and looked at her own reflection in the low moonlight coming through the window. Her dark hair had come loose from its careful evening style, falling messily around a face that was still red-eyed from tears she had refused to let fall in front of anyone else. She studied herself for a long moment, memorizing this version of her own face, because she suspected that whoever she became after tonight would look different, would carry herself differently. would never again be the young woman who waited quietly for someone else to choose her. Never again, she whispered to her reflection, and the words settled into her chest like a promise. She left through the back of the house, avoiding the main paths where a night patrol might spot her. She knew the patrol routes better than most, had memorized them during years of training exercises, and she used that knowledge now to slip through the territory unseen, moving from shadow to shadow, with the quiet efficiency of someone who had trained her whole life for exactly this kind of moment, even if she had never imagined she would use those skills to escape her own home. At the eastern border of the territory, where a shallow stream marked the boundary between pack land and the unclaimed wilderness beyond, Elena stopped and looked back one final time. From this distance, she could see the faint glow of the last dying embers of the celebration fire, could see the dark shapes of the houses where everyone she had ever known was sleeping, unaware that she was standing at the edge of everything she had ever loved, about to walk away from all of it. She thought of Marcus's face when he said Sabrina's name. She thought of the practiced calm in his voice, the way he had not hesitated even slightly, as if the decision had been made long before tonight, and he had simply been waiting for the right ceremony to announce it. She wondered how long he had known. She wondered if there had ever been a single moment when what she thought was real between them had actually meant something to him, or if she had spent years building a future in her mind that had never existed anywhere except inside her own hopeful heart. She did not have an answer, and she understood, standing there at the border with the stream murmuring quietly beside her, that she might never have an answer. Some questions simply did not deserve any more of her time. She shifted, the change rippling through her body in the practiced motion she had performed thousands of times before. Fur replacing skin, 4 legs replacing 2. The whole world suddenly sharper and louder and full of scents she could not have detected in her human form. As a wolf, the sadness in her chest did not disappear, but it became something she could carry more easily, something that lived beside her strength instead of beneath it. She crossed the stream without looking back again. The wilderness on the other side was darker, wilder, full of unfamiliar scents that made every instinct in her body scream caution. She had no territory here, no pack, no protection. She was, for the first time in her entire life, completely and utterly alone. But as she moved deeper into the trees, putting distance between herself and the only home she had ever known, she felt something unexpected rising beneath the grief and the fear. She felt free. It was a strange, sharp kind of freedom, the kind that came with real cost attached to it, but it was freedom nonetheless. No one in this wilderness knew her as the girl who had almost been chosen and then was not. No one here had watched her clap politely while her heart broke in front of an entire crowd. Out here, she was simply a wolf, moving through the dark, deciding for the very first time in her life exactly where she wanted to go and what she wanted to become. She ran through the night without any clear destination, letting her paws carry her farther and farther from the territory that had raised her, farther from the fire, farther from Marcus and Sabrina, and the future the pack had already decided for her. She ran until her legs ached and her breath came in ragged gasps, and even then she kept running, because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant remembering, and remembering was the one thing she could not yet allow herself to do. By the time the first gray light of dawn began to touch the horizon, Elena had crossed farther into unclaimed wilderness than any pack member she knew had ever traveled alone. She finally slowed to a walk, then stopped completely, standing in a small clearing surrounded by tall pines, her sides heaving with exhaustion. She shifted back to her human form and sat down heavily on the cold ground, wrapping her arms around her knees as the adrenaline that had carried her through the night began to fade, leaving only bone-deep tiredness and a grief she could no longer outrun. She allowed herself, finally, alone in that clearing, with no one to witness it, to cry. She cried for the years she had spent waiting for a future that was never coming. She cried for the friendship she had left behind, without saying goodbye. For Dana's worried face in the firelight, for the small house she had grown up in, for a version of her life that had ended the moment Marcus said a name that was not hers. She cried until there was nothing left inside her but a strange, hollow calm, and when the sun finally rose fully over the tree line, painting the clearing in soft gold light, Elena wiped her face, stood up, and looked out at the unfamiliar wilderness, stretching endlessly in every direction. She had no pack, she had no territory, she had no plan beyond survival for one more day. But she also had, for the first time in her life, no one deciding her future for her. Elena Voss took a deep breath, tasting the unfamiliar air of a world she did not yet know, and began to walk forward into it, alone. The first 3 days alone taught Elena Voss more about survival than 20 years of training inside the safety of her pack ever had. Training exercises always had an edge of safety hidden underneath them, a senior wolf watching from a distance, a clear path back to warm shelter, and a full meal waiting at the end of the day. Out here, in unclaimed wilderness, with no pack marks to guide her, and no elder tracking her progress, every mistake carried real weight. On her second night alone, she misjudged the depth of a stream while trying to cross it in human form, and lost half of her remaining dried meat to the current before she could grab it back. She sat on the bank afterward, soaked and shivering, and reminded herself that mistakes like this one were survivable. Mistakes like drawing the attention of a territorial pack were not. She quickly learned to move mostly at dusk and dawn, when her wolf-form senses were sharpest, but the light was still dim enough to keep her hidden from anyone who might be watching from a distance. She learned to read the wind before crossing open ground, to circle wide around any scent marker that suggested another pack's territory, to sleep in short stretches with one ear always listening, rather than falling into the deep, trusting sleep she had known her whole life, surrounded by people who would protect her if danger came. Out here, she was the only one protecting herself, and that responsibility settled into her chest like a second heartbeat, always present, never fully quiet. Hunger became a constant companion during those early days. She had left with only a small amount of dried meat, never intending for her exile to stretch beyond a single desperate night of walking, and she had not planned for the reality that finding food alone, in unfamiliar territory, without the coordinated hunting techniques of a full pack, was far harder than she had ever imagined. Wolves hunted in groups for a reason. A pack could bring down large prey through teamwork, could corner an animal from multiple directions, could share the risk and the reward equally among many bodies working together. Alone, Elena found herself reduced to smaller prey, rabbits and ground birds, animals fast enough that half her attempts ended in nothing but wasted energy and growing frustration. On the fourth day, exhausted and lightheaded from hunger, she nearly made the mistake of chasing a deer into what turned out to be the edge of another pack's marked territory. She caught the scent just in time, a strong, fresh boundary marker laid down within the last day, and she skidded to a stop so abruptly that she tumbled into the underbrush, scraping her side against a fallen branch. She lay there for a long moment, catching her breath, staring up through the canopy at the gray sky above her, and she allowed herself, just for a moment, to wonder if she had made a terrible mistake, leaving everything she knew for a life this hard and this uncertain. The thought did not last long. Whenever her mind tried to wander back toward the pack, back toward the warm houses and shared meals and the safety of belonging somewhere, it inevitably wandered next toward the fire, toward Marcus's voice saying a name that was not hers, toward Sabrina's hand lifted triumphantly into the firelight. The memory was sharp enough to cut through hunger, sharp enough to remind her exactly why she had chosen this instead. She would rather struggle alone under an open sky than sit comfortably inside a life built around watching someone else claim the future she had once believed belonged to her. She rose from the underbrush, brushed the dirt from her side, and kept moving. By the end of her first week, Elena had developed a rough sense of the land around her. She was traveling through a wide stretch of unclaimed wilderness that sat between 3 established pack territories, land too contested and too frequently patrolled by rival scouts for any single pack to safely claim outright. It was dangerous ground precisely because it belonged to no one, which meant any wolf found here could be treated as a trespasser by whichever pack happened to notice first. But it also meant, Elena began to realize, that this land had gone largely unused. Prey moved through it undisturbed by regular hunting pressure. Water sources ran clean and untouched. If she could find a way to survive the danger of crossing paths with a rival patrol, this contested land held resources that established territories, hunted constantly by their own packs, no longer possessed in the same abundance. The realization did not fully form into a plan yet, not in those early days when survival alone consumed every waking thought, but it planted a small seed in the back of her mind, an idea she would return to later once the sharpest edges of grief and hunger had dulled enough to let her think clearly again. On her 9th day alone, Elena finally managed a successful hunt. bringing down a young deer after a long chase that left her legs trembling with exhaustion. She ate until she could not eat anymore, then carefully buried the remainder beneath layers of leaves and dirt, marking the spot in her memory the way she had been taught as a pup, though she had never expected to need that particular lesson quite this badly. For the first time since leaving the fire behind her, she felt something close to steady. Her body had food. Her mind, exhausted from constant vigilance, finally allowed itself a few hours of deeper sleep. She dreamed of the pack that night, the first time she had allowed herself to dream of home since leaving. In the dream, she was standing at the edge of the gathering ground again, watching the fire burn, watching Marcus lift his chin to speak. But in the dream, when he opened his mouth, no sound came out at all, and Elena woke before she ever learned whether the dream version of him said her name or someone else's. She lay still in the gray light of early morning, her heart pounding, and told herself firmly that it did not matter which name the dream had chosen. That door had already closed. She had closed it herself, walking away from the fire with her chin held high. 2 weeks into her exile, Elena crossed paths with the first other creature she had encountered since leaving her pack, though it was not the kind of encounter she had feared. She caught the scent of blood and fear on the wind one afternoon, and followed it cautiously, curious despite the danger, only to find a young wolf pup tangled in what looked like an old trapper's snare, left behind by human hunters who occasionally passed through this contested land. The pup could not have been more than a few months old, far too young to have survived long alone, its sides scraped raw from struggling against the wire, its small body trembling with exhaustion and fear. Elena's first instinct was caution. A pup this young almost certainly belonged to some pack nearby, and freeing it might draw exactly the kind of attention she had spent 2 weeks carefully avoiding. But she could not walk away from a frightened, injured pup left to die alone in a trap, not when she understood, more intimately than she wished she did, exactly what it felt like to be abandoned and afraid with no one coming to help. She shifted to her human form and worked carefully, gently, to free the wire from around the pup's leg, murmuring low, soothing sounds the entire time, to keep the small creature calm. Once freed, the pup did not run. Instead, exhausted and grateful, it pressed itself against Elena's side and simply stayed there, shivering, watching her with wide, uncertain eyes. Elena sat with it for a long time, in the fading afternoon light, unsure what to do next. She searched the surrounding area for signs of a nearby pack, for scent markers or trails that might lead her to the pup's family, but found nothing. Either the pup had wandered impossibly far from its territory, or something worse had happened to whatever pack it once belonged to. She could not simply leave it. She understood, somewhere deep in her chest, that this small moment of unexpected companionship was about to change the shape of her exile, though she did not yet know how much. She named the pup Whisper, for the quiet way it had pressed against her side without making a single sound of protest, and from that evening forward, she was no longer entirely alone. Whisper could not hunt for itself yet, could not defend either of them from real danger, but its presence gave Elena something she had not realized she was missing. A reason to plan beyond simple day-to-day survival. A pup needed shelter that would hold through changing weather. A pup needed a steady, reliable source of food, not the unpredictable feast or famine rhythm of a lone hunter's success and failure. A pup needed, in other words, exactly the kind of settled territory Elena had begun quietly imagining during her long, hungry days crossing this contested land. 3 days after finding Whisper, Elena made her decision. She would stop wandering. She would find a defensible piece of this unclaimed wilderness, land dangerous enough that no established pack had bothered to claim it, and she would make it her own. She did not know yet how one lone wolf, with only a half-grown pup for company, could hope to hold territory against the rival patrols that occasionally passed through this land. She only knew that wandering without purpose had kept her alive for 2 weeks, but it would not be enough to keep her alive, and Whisper safe, for 2 years. She began scouting in earnest, studying the terrain with the same careful attention she had once given to pack training exercises, searching for a location with natural defenses, a reliable water source, and enough distance from all 3 surrounding pack territories that regular patrols were unlikely to stumble across it by accident. She found herself drawn again and again to a particular stretch of forest at the very edge of the contested land, a place where the terrain rose into a series of rocky outcrops, that would be difficult for any large group to approach without warning, and where a clean spring ran year-round through a narrow, easily defended gorge. It was dangerous land. It sat close enough to a nearby pack's border that occasional scouts passed within scenting distance, and the rocky terrain that offered good defense also made hunting more difficult than open ground would have. But Elena stood at the edge of that gorge one evening, whisper curled against her feet after a long day of walking, and felt something settle in her chest that she had not expected to feel again so soon after losing everything. She felt purpose. She was done running. She was done drifting through unclaimed land with no plan beyond surviving one more day. If no established pack wanted this dangerous, difficult stretch of contested wilderness, then she would take it for herself, and she would build something here that belonged entirely to her, shaped by no one's decisions but her own. That night, for the first time since leaving the fire behind her, Elena Voss slept without dreaming of the pack she had lost. Instead, she dreamed of the territory she intended to build, rough shapes of a future not yet formed, but hers, completely and entirely hers, in a way nothing in her old life had ever truly been. Claiming a territory alone was nothing like Elena had imagined it would be when she first stood at the edge of the rocky gorge and decided this land would become hers. She had grown up watching her own pack's territory function as a finished thing, boundaries already marked, hunting grounds already established, shelters already built by generations of wolves who came before her. She had never once had to think about where the very first boundary marker should be placed, or how a single wolf, without the strength of numbers behind her, could hope to make any piece of land feel truly defended. She started small. On her first morning in the gorge, she walked the rough outline of what she intended to claim, marking trees and stones at careful intervals the way she had been taught as a pup, though every mark felt strange and almost foolish, laid down by a single set of paws instead of an entire pack working together. Whisper trotted along beside her the whole way, curious and clumsy, sniffing at each marker, as though trying to understand what this strange, solitary ritual meant. The marking took most of the day, and by evening, Elena's legs ached from the uneven terrain, and her stomach growled with a hunger she had learned to simply carry alongside everything else. She sat at the mouth of a shallow cave she had found tucked into the rocky outcrop, one that would offer shelter from rain and wind, and, more importantly, could be defended from a single narrow entrance if anything ever came looking for trouble. She watched the sun set over land that, as of today, carried her scent on every boundary tree, and she allowed herself a small, tired moment of pride. It would not be enough, she knew. A boundary marking alone did not create a territory. A territory needed to be defended, needed to be maintained, needed other wolves to recognize and respect the claim, and a single lone female with a half-grown pup for company was not exactly an intimidating force to any pack that might wander close enough to notice the new markers. But it was a beginning, and after 2 weeks of aimless survival, a beginning felt like more than Elena had dared to hope for. The first real test of her claim came 10 days later. Elena was returning from a hunt, a rabbit hanging from her jaws, moving carefully along the eastern edge of her marked boundary, when she caught an unfamiliar scent cutting sharply across the wind. She froze instantly. The scent belonged to a wolf, male, and it was fresh, meaning whoever it belonged to was close, likely close enough to have already noticed the change in the land's usual scent markers. Elena set the rabbit down carefully behind a fallen log and moved forward alone, low and quiet, to investigate. She found him standing near one of her boundary markers, a large gray wolf sniffing at the tree with obvious confusion, clearly trying to understand why unclaimed land he had probably crossed through many times before now carried the fresh scent of an unfamiliar wolf. Elena recognized, from the confident set of his shoulders and the quality of his coat, that this was no ordinary lone wolf. This was a scout, likely from one of the 3 packs bordering this contested land, sent to check the boundaries the way scouts regularly did. For a long moment, Elena considered simply retreating, letting him leave and report whatever he chose, without revealing herself at all. But she understood, standing there watching him investigate her claim, that avoidance would only delay the inevitable. If she wanted this land, she would eventually have to be seen holding it. Better, she decided, for that moment to happen on her own terms, in a controlled encounter she initiated, rather than in some future ambush she failed to see coming. Bake. She stepped out from the trees. The Gray Scout's head snapped up instantly, his body going rigid with surprise as he took in the sight of her. A lone female wolf, standing calmly at the edge of territory that had, until recently, belonged to no one. For a tense moment, neither of them moved. Elena kept her posture deliberately relaxed, refusing to show the fear pulsing beneath her calm exterior, because she had learned during her years of training that confidence, even manufactured confidence, often mattered more in a standoff than actual strength. "This land is claimed," she said, her wolf voice carrying clearly across the short distance between them, calm and steady, despite the pounding of her heart. "You're welcome to pass through, but you'll not find easy pickings here. I hunt this ground now, and I hold it." The scout studied her for a long moment, clearly weighing his options. A single lone female wolf, however confident her posture, was not typically considered a serious threat to an established pack's interests, and Elena watched him consider, briefly, whether to simply push past her claim and report back that the marks meant nothing. But something in her steady gaze, or perhaps simply the boldness of a lone wolf claiming contested ground that even established packs had avoided, seemed to give him pause. "You hold this alone?" he finally asked, something between curiosity and disbelief coloring his voice. "For now," Elena answered honestly, because there was no point pretending otherwise when the evidence of her solitude was plain to see. "That won't always be true." The scout huffed, a sound that might have been amusement or might have been dismissal, and after a moment longer of consideration, he turned and retreated back the way he had come, disappearing into the trees without further challenge. Elena stood alone at her boundary for a long time after he left, her legs trembling now that the confrontation was over, adrenaline draining out of her body all at once. She had survived her first true test as a territory holder, but she understood clearly that this would not be her last, and next time, she might not face a scout satisfied to simply retreat and report. That night, she began building in earnest. Over the following weeks, Elena worked from dawn until exhaustion forced her to stop, expanding the shallow cave into a more defensible shelter, clearing brush to create clear sight lines around her chosen ground, learning every inch of the terrain so thoroughly that she could navigate it blind if she ever needed to. She hunted constantly, both to feed herself and Whisper, and to gradually build a small reserve of preserved meat against the harder months she knew were coming. She practiced her fighting forms daily, alone in small clearings, honing skills that had once been trained through friendly sparring matches against packmates, and were now sharpened instead by the quiet, unglamorous discipline of solitary repetition. Whisper grew steadily during this time, no longer the fragile, trembling pup Elena had found tangled in a trapper's wire. The young wolf's legs grew longer, its coat thicker, its confidence expanding alongside its body, until it began joining Elena on short hunts, clumsy at first but improving with every attempt. Elena found herself talking to Whisper often during the long days of work, explaining her plans out loud as though the young wolf could understand every word, and in a strange way, having something to talk to, even if it could not answer back, kept the worst edges of loneliness from cutting quite as deep as they might have otherwise. The second real test of her claim came almost 2 months after the scout's visit, and this time it was not so easily resolved. Elena woke one morning to find 3 unfamiliar scents crossing her boundary at once, fresh enough that whoever left them could not be far away. Her stomach dropped. 3 wolves moving together meant this was no simple scouting patrol. This was a group with purpose, likely sent specifically to test whether the boundary markers a lone scout had reported weeks earlier represented any real threat worth taking seriously. She found them near the spring at the heart of her gorge, 3 wolves in their human forms, clearly having shifted to walk more easily through the narrow terrain. 2 males and 1 female, all wearing the confident bearing of pack wolves, who had never once questioned whether they belonged wherever they chose to walk. Elena approached them in her own human form, deliberately unhurried, though her heart hammered against her ribs with a fear she refused to let show on her face. "You're standing on claimed ground," she said, stopping a careful distance away, close enough to be heard clearly, but far enough to give herself room to react if this conversation turned into something worse. The tallest of the 3 men, clearly the leader of this small group, turned to look at her with an expression of open skepticism. "One woman doesn't hold territory," he said, "especially not territory this valuable. This spring feeds half the hunting ground within a day's walk. You really think you can keep 3 packs worth of scouts off land like this by yourself? I don't need to keep 3 packs off, Elena said, holding her ground even as every instinct screamed at her to retreat from the obvious physical mismatch between herself and 3 trained pack fighters. I only need to make holding this ground more trouble than it's worth, to any single pack willing to test me. And I promise you, I intend to be more trouble than you're expecting. The leader laughed, short and humorless, and took a step forward, clearly intending to press the confrontation further, to see whether her bold words carried any real strength behind them. Elena's body tensed, ready to shift, ready to fight if it came to that, though she understood with cold clarity that fighting 3 trained pack wolves alone would likely end badly for her regardless of how skilled she was individually. But before the confrontation could escalate further, a low growl rose from the trees behind her, and Elena watched surprise flicker across all 3 intruders' faces as Whisper emerged from the underbrush. No longer the small, fragile pup they might have expected, but a young wolf, now nearly full-grown, teeth bared, standing protectively at Elena's side. It was not a decisive advantage. 2 wolves, even a strong one and a young one, still stood outmatched against 3 trained fighters, but the sight of a second defender, unexpected and clearly loyal, seemed to shift something in the leader's calculation. He studied Elena and Whisper for a long moment, weighing the cost of a fight against uncertain reward, and Elena watched him do the mental math every experienced fighter learned to do before committing to real conflict. "This isn't worth it," one of the other men finally said quietly, glancing at the leader. "Contested land, uncertain claim, not worth starting real trouble over a spring. We can find water from elsewhere." The leader held Elena's gaze a moment longer, clearly still weighing his pride against practical caution, and then, slowly, he stepped back. "We'll be watching," he said, his voice carrying a warning even as he retreated. "If this claim proves weak, we'll come back and take what we want." "You're welcome to try," Elena answered steadily, refusing to let relief show on her face until the 3 intruders had fully disappeared back into the trees. Once they were gone, her legs finally gave out beneath her, and she sat down hard on the rocky ground, shaking with the aftermath of adrenaline. Whisper pressed close against her side, whining softly, and Elena wrapped an arm around the young wolf's neck, grateful beyond words for the unexpected loyalty that had likely just saved her life. "We held it," she whispered into Whisper's fur. Disbelief and pride tangled together in her chest. "We actually held it." It would not be the last challenge to her claim. She understood that clearly. But she had survived the first serious test, and surviving it had taught her something important. She did not need to be strong enough to defeat every threat outright. She only needed to be dangerous enough, unpredictable enough, and stubborn enough that challenging her claim never felt worth the trouble it promised to cause. That evening, as the sun set behind the rocky gorge she now called home, Elena Voss began to believe, for the first time since walking away from the fire, that she might actually survive this new life she had chosen for herself. And more than survive it, she might, given enough time and enough determination, actually build something real here, something entirely her own, shaped by no one's choices but her own 2 hands. Word about the lone female wolf holding disputed land near the spring began to spread faster than Elena expected, carried between the 3 neighboring packs, through the casual gossip of scouts and traders who crossed paths at territory borders. She had not intended to become a subject of conversation. She had simply intended to survive, to build a small, defensible life for herself, and whisper away from anyone who might remind her of the pack and the fire, and the name that was not hers. Instead, within a few months of holding her ground against the group of 3 intruders, Elena found that her isolated gorge had quietly become something of a local legend, whispered about at gatherings she would never attend, discussed with a mixture of skepticism and grudging respect by wolves, who could not quite believe a single female had managed to hold contested land against every pack surrounding it. The first stranger to actually seek her out, rather than stumble across her territory by accident, arrived on a cold morning, nearly 4 months after Elena had first claimed the gorge. She caught his scent long before she saw him, an unfamiliar wolf moving slowly and deliberately toward her boundary, without the confident, testing energy of a scout probing for weakness. This scent carried something different, something closer to exhaustion and caution combined. She met him at the boundary line, wary but curious, and found a young man perhaps a year or 2 older than herself, his clothes worn and his frame thin, in a way that suggested he had not eaten well in some time. He held his hands open and visible as he approached, a clear signal of peaceful intent that Elena appreciated, even as she kept her own guard raised. "My name is Nolan," he said, stopping a respectful distance from the boundary marker. "I heard there's a lone wolf holding ground out here." "I heard she doesn't turn away anyone willing to earn their place." Elena tilted her head, surprised by the specificity of the claim. "I never said that to anyone." "No," Nolan agreed, a tired, wry smile crossing his face. "But it's what people are saying about you anyway. I figured it was worth the walk to find out if it's true." Elena studied him carefully, noting the exhaustion in his posture, the careful way he kept his weight balanced, as though ready to run if this conversation turned hostile, the faint scar along his jaw that suggested a difficult history he had not yet explained. She asked him, simply, why he had left whatever pack he came from, and Nolan's expression tightened before he answered. "I was accused of something I didn't do," he said quietly. "My pack believed the accuser over me. I was exiled, rather than given a chance to prove otherwise." He paused, then added, with a bitterness that Elena understood completely. "It's easier for a pack to remove one troublesome wolf than to admit their judgment might have been wrong." Elena felt something shift in her chest, recognition passing between two people who had each been failed by the structures they once trusted to protect them. She had not planned to build anything beyond a small, private territory for herself and Whisper. But standing at that boundary, looking at a stranger who carried his own version of the wound she still carried, she understood that turning him away would mean becoming exactly the kind of pack that had failed him in the first place, judging first, and asking questions never. "You'll hunt for yourself until I trust you," she said finally. "You'll follow rules I set, because this is still my territory and my claim, and I won't apologize for that. But you can stay, if you're willing to work for it." Nolan's shoulders sagged with visible relief, and he nodded quickly, gratitude plain on his tired face. He was, as it turned out, the first of many. Over the following months, more wolves began finding their way to Elena's territory, drawn by whispered stories of a lone female holding contested ground and offering shelter to anyone willing to earn their place through loyalty and work, rather than bloodline or political connection. Some arrived exiled like Nolan, cast out by packs unwilling to give them fair judgment. Others arrived orphaned, their original packs destroyed by conflict or disease, left with nowhere else to turn. A young woman named Priya arrived nearly 6 months after Nolan, having survived alone for over a year after her small pack was wiped out entirely by a territorial dispute with a larger, more aggressive group. A quiet, steady man named Callum arrived shortly after, simply tired, he said, of pack politics that valued bloodline and family connections over actual skill and loyalty. Elena did not accept everyone who arrived at her border. She turned away wolves whose stories did not add up, whose eyes carried something calculating rather than desperate, whose presence felt more like opportunity-seeking than genuine need. She had learned, through hard experience, exactly how dangerous it could be to extend trust carelessly, and she was determined that whatever she built here would not repeat the mistakes of blind loyalty that had left her so vulnerable in her old pack. But for those she did accept, she built something deliberately different from the pack structure she had left behind. There was no bloodline hierarchy here, no political marriages arranged to secure alliances between wealthy families. Leadership and respect were earned through demonstrated loyalty and contribution, not inherited through birth or granted through favorable connections. Elena remained, by unspoken agreement, the leader of this growing group, not because tradition demanded it, but because she had claimed the ground first and had proven, repeatedly, that she was willing to fight and sacrifice for the safety of everyone who chose to stand beside her. The work of building a functioning pack from a loose collection of exiles and orphans was harder than Elena had anticipated. Wolves who had each survived their own individual trauma did not automatically know how to trust each other, and the early months were marked by small conflicts, misunderstandings born from wolves used to different pack traditions, disagreements about hunting territory, and shelter assignments that required careful, patient mediation. Elena found herself, more often than she expected, playing the role of arbiter, listening to grievances from both sides of a dispute, and working to find solutions that felt fair rather than simply convenient. She discovered, somewhat to her own surprise, that she was good at this kind of leadership. She had spent her whole life watching Marcus lead through inherited authority, through the confidence of a bloodline that had held power for generations, and she had assumed leadership required that same kind of unquestioned, inherited certainty. Instead, she found her own version of leadership, built on something different: careful listening, consistent fairness, and a willingness to admit when she herself did not know the right answer, and needed to think through a problem alongside the people affected by it. Priya became, over time, something like a second voice of authority within the growing group, her calm, practical temperament balancing Elena's more instinctive, protective leadership style. Nolan proved himself an excellent hunter, teaching several of the newer arrivals techniques he had learned from his old pack that Elena's group had not previously known. Callum, quiet but observant, took on the role of watching the territory's boundaries, developing an almost uncanny sense for when unfamiliar scents crossed into their claimed ground. By the end of the first year, what had begun as a single lone woman and an injured pup had grown into a functioning group of nearly a dozen wolves, each carrying their own history of loss and exile, each choosing, day after day, to remain and contribute to something new, rather than continue wandering alone through unclaimed wilderness. They were not, technically, a recognized pack in the eyes of the established territories surrounding them. They held no formal bloodline claim, no political alliances, no ancient treaty granting them rights to the land they occupied. But they held the ground itself, defended it together, hunted it together, and slowly, steadily, built shelters and stores and traditions of their own that had nothing to do with the packs any of them had left behind. Elena thought of Marcus less often as the months passed, though the memory never fully disappeared. Some nights, sitting near the fire they had built at the heart of their small settlement, listening to Nolan tell an exaggerated story about a hunt gone wrong, watching Priya patiently teach a newer arrival how to properly dress a kill, she would catch herself thinking that this strange, hard-won community built from broken pieces and second chances, felt more genuinely like a pack than anything she had known in her old life, where belonging had been assumed rather than earned, and where a single decision made by one man in front of a crowd could unmake years of assumed connection in a single sentence. She still bore the scar of that night, the memory of Marcus's voice saying a name that was not hers. But standing at the edge of her growing territory one evening, watching the sun set over land she had claimed with nothing but stubbornness and determination, watching a dozen wolves who trusted her enough to call this dangerous, contested ground their home, Elena understood that she had built something Marcus's inherited authority could never grant her. She had built something entirely, undeniably her own. The true test of everything Elena had built came 14 months after she first claimed the gorge, and it arrived not as a small testing patrol, but as a serious, organized threat that made every previous confrontation look like a minor disagreement by comparison. It began with Callum's report, delivered in his usual quiet, unhurried manner that nonetheless carried an edge of real concern. He had spent the morning tracking an unusually large cluster of scent markers along the northern boundary, fresher and more numerous than any patrol pattern he had observed before. When Elena joined him to investigate personally, she understood immediately why his careful calm had slipped into genuine worry. The scent markers belonged to at least 15 different wolves, all moving with the coordinated precision of an organized group, not the casual wandering of scouts or curious travelers. "This isn't a testing patrol," Elena said, crouching to examine the markers more closely. "This is a planned approach." They returned to the settlement immediately, and Elena called together everyone capable of fighting, now numbering just over a dozen wolves who had spent the past year building genuine skill and coordination through countless shared hunts and training sessions. She laid out what they knew plainly, without softening the seriousness of the situation. A group this size, moving with this much coordination, was not interested in testing whether her claim held weak boundaries. This group intended to take the territory outright, likely believing that a settlement built from exiles and orphans, however successfully it had held smaller challenges, could not withstand a truly determined assault. Priya, ever practical, immediately began organizing their limited defenses, identifying the narrow gorge entrance as their strongest natural advantage, a place where numbers mattered less than terrain, and where a smaller, well-positioned group could hold against a larger force, attempting to funnel through a bottleneck. Nolan and several of the stronger fighters began reinforcing the barriers they had built along that entrance months earlier, more out of habit than genuine expectation of needing them for anything beyond deterring casual thieves. Elena spent that night unable to sleep, running through every possible strategy in her mind, weighing the terrible calculation of how many of the people who had trusted her leadership might be lost if this confrontation turned into open conflict. She had built this settlement on a promise, spoken and unspoken, that she would protect everyone who chose to stand beside her. She could not bear the thought of that promise failing now, after everything they had all sacrificed to build this fragile, hard-won home together. Near dawn, an idea began to form, born from a memory of her training days back in her old pack, a strategy her old training master had once taught about deterring larger threats not through direct confrontation, but through carefully managed uncertainty. A large, organized group approaching unfamiliar contested territory would already be operating with some degree of caution, uncertain exactly what defenses they might encounter. If Elena could amplify that uncertainty, make her settlement appear more dangerous and better defended than its actual numbers suggested, she might be able to avoid open conflict entirely. She gathered her people again at first light and explained her plan. They would not hide their numbers or pretend weakness. Instead, they would demonstrate absolute confidence, positioning fighters visibly along the gorge's natural high ground, using the terrain to make their group appear larger and more entrenched than a simple head count would reveal. She would meet the approaching group personally, at the boundary, projecting the same unshaken authority she had used to face down the very first scout who challenged her claim, over a year ago now, when she had been entirely alone, with nothing but a young pup for company. The approaching group arrived at midday, exactly as Callum had predicted, based on the pace of the scent trail. Elena watched them emerge from the tree line, 15 wolves in human form, all wearing the marks of a single established pack, moving with the disciplined confidence of trained fighters, who had likely never once questioned an order to take contested ground by force. At the front of the group walked a broad-shouldered man, whose bearing immediately marked him as their leader, his expression carrying the particular arrogance of someone accustomed to having his demands met without serious resistance. Elena stepped forward to meet them alone, though she knew her people watched from the high ground above, positioned exactly where they would be most visible, exactly where the terrain would make their actual numbers difficult to accurately judge from below. "This territory belongs to my pack," Elena said clearly, before the leader could speak first, refusing to cede control of the conversation's opening terms. "You're standing on claimed and defended ground." The leader's mouth curved into a condescending smile. "We've heard the stories," he said. "A handful of exiles playing at being a pack. My alpha grows tired of hearing rumors about disputed land his hunters could use. We're here to settle the matter permanently." "Then you already understand the risk you're taking," Elena replied, keeping her voice level, despite the fear pounding beneath her calm exterior. 15 of you against ground. We've spent over a year fortifying. Terrain we know better than our own reflections. And defenders positioned above you, who will lose nothing, by making this as costly as possible for every one of you standing here today. Ask yourself honestly, whether your alpha's curiosity about rumors is worth the number of your people who won't walk home from settling this matter." She let the silence stretch after her words, refusing to fill it with further argument, trusting the visible positioning of her fighters along the high ground to do the persuading that words alone could not accomplish. She watched the leader's confidence flicker, just slightly, as his eyes moved up toward the ridge where Nolan and several others stood with visible weapons, deliberately silhouetted against the sky, to appear as imposing as possible. "You'd risk real conflict over disputed wilderness?" The leader asked, though his tone had shifted, uncertainty creeping into the arrogance he had arrived with. "I'd risk everything to protect what my people and I have built here," Elena answered simply, and she meant every word of it completely. "The question isn't whether I'm willing to fight for this ground. I already proved that, over a year ago, against a smaller group than yours, and I'm still standing here today. The question is whether taking this particular piece of contested land is actually worth the cost your alpha will pay in wolves who don't come home." The standoff stretched for several long, tense minutes, during which Elena forced herself to remain perfectly still, refusing to let any flicker of her genuine fear show on her face. She thought of every person watching from the ridge above her, people who had trusted her leadership enough to stand and fight if this confrontation turned violent, and she understood clearly that her performance in this single moment might determine whether any of them survived the day. Finally, the leader turned and spoke quietly, with two of his senior fighters. A hushed conversation Elena could not fully hear, but could read clearly enough through the tension in their body language. After a moment, he turned back to face her, his expression carefully neutral now, stripped of the arrogance he had arrived with. "This isn't finished," he said, though the words carried less real threat now than simple face-saving posturing. "But my alpha didn't send us here to lose good fighters, over disputed ground. He's never even seen personally. We'll report back that the rumors were accurate. This territory is genuinely held." He turned and led his group back into the trees, and Elena did not allow herself to breathe fully until the last of their scent trails had faded from the wind. When she finally climbed the ridge to join her people, relief and adrenaline crashing through her body all at once, she found them celebrating, with the particular fierce joy of people who had genuinely believed, moments earlier, that they might be facing their final day together. Nolan pulled her into a rough embrace, laughing with disbelieving relief. Priya, normally so composed, actually cried a little, gripping Elena's hands tightly, and thanking her for the strategy that had likely saved every life standing on that ridge. Even Whisper, fully grown now into a strong, capable wolf who had stood among the visible defenders on the ridge, pressed close against Elena's side, tail wagging with the simple joy of having survived a genuinely frightening day. That evening, gathered around their fire, the mood carried a different quality than any celebration Elena had witnessed since leaving her old pack behind. This was not celebration born from someone else's decision, from watching an alpha choose a mate according to political calculation. This was celebration born entirely from their own shared survival, their own strategy, their own collective courage in the face of genuine danger. Elena sat near the fire, watching her people laugh and embrace and share stories of the tense standoff, already growing slightly exaggerated with each retelling, and she understood, with a clarity that settled deep into her bones, that this settlement had crossed some invisible threshold today. They were no longer simply a loose collection of exiles, surviving day by day on contested ground. They had proven, decisively, that they could defend what they built together against a serious, organized threat, and word of today's confrontation would spread just as quickly as the earlier rumors had, carried between the surrounding packs, until every territory bordering their contested land understood clearly that this settlement was not merely surviving. It was becoming something that other packs would need to genuinely reckon with. Elena looked around the fire at the faces gathered there, each one carrying their own history of loss and exile, each one having chosen, day after day, to remain and build something new, rather than continue wandering alone. She thought, briefly, of the fire she had walked away from over a year ago, of Marcus's voice saying a name that was not hers, of the future the old pack had already decided for her, without ever once asking what she wanted for herself. She had built something entirely different here, something earned rather than inherited, chosen rather than assumed, defended through genuine sacrifice rather than granted through bloodline and political convenience. Whatever came next, whatever challenges still waited in the unclaimed wilderness surrounding them, Elena understood clearly, watching her people celebrate around the fire, that she would face them exactly the way she had faced today's threat. Not alone, never alone again. Marcus Kane stood in his study long after midnight, staring at a border dispute report he had already read 3 times without absorbing a single useful detail, and understood, not for the first time in recent months, that his marriage had become something he actively dreaded returning home to think about. 2 years had passed since the night he stood before his entire pack and spoke Sabrina Cole's name into the firelight, and in that time, the alliance he had believed would strengthen his pack's political standing had instead settled into something quiet and hollow, a partnership built entirely on obligation rather than the genuine connection he had once, foolishly, believed might grow between them over time. It had not grown. If anything, the distance between them had widened steadily, month after month, until their shared house felt less like a home and more like 2 separate territories occupying the same physical space, each of them moving carefully around the other's schedule to avoid conversations that inevitably circled back toward the same unresolved tension neither of them wanted to address directly. Sabrina had made no secret, in the private moments when her careful public composure slipped, that she understood exactly what their marriage actually was: a political arrangement, orchestrated by her family's ambition and the Elder Council's approval, designed to secure resources and influence for both packs, rather than built on any genuine bond between the two people expected to sustain it. She had accepted the arrangement with the same practical calculation Marcus had once mistaken for warmth, and over 2 years, that practical calculation had calcified into something closer to quiet resentment on both sides, neither of them quite willing to voice the growing certainty that they had built their shared future on a foundation that could never truly hold weight. Marcus set the border report aside and rubbed his eyes, exhaustion settling deep into his shoulders. He thought, as he had allowed himself to think more frequently over recent months, despite every effort to push the thought away, of Elena Voss standing in the crowd on the night of his selection ceremony, her expression carefully composed, even as he watched something break behind her eyes when he spoke a name that was not hers. He had told himself, in the immediate aftermath of that night, that he had made the only choice available to him, that the Elder Council's pressure to secure an alliance with the politically powerful Ashwood pack had left him no real alternative, that duty to his pack's survival mattered more than personal feeling. He had believed that reasoning completely, once. 2 years of quiet, hollow marriage had eroded his certainty considerably. A knock at his study door pulled him from thoughts he had learned to keep carefully private. His second-in-command, a steady, experienced tracker named Owen, entered with an expression that immediately signaled something important had happened. "We have a problem along the southern border," Owen said without preamble, setting a fresh report on Marcus's desk. "Our hunting parties have been finding the southern grounds increasingly picked over. When we sent scouts to investigate, they discovered something unexpected." Marcus read through the report quickly, his exhaustion sharpening into genuine attention as the details registered. Somewhere in the contested wilderness bordering their southern territory, land that had gone largely unclaimed for as long as Marcus could remember, a settlement had established itself, fortified enough to hold significant hunting ground, populated by enough wolves to make casual dismissal impossible. The report described a defensible position built around a natural spring, boundary markers respected even by the larger surrounding packs, and, most striking of all, leadership held by a single unmated female alpha who had, according to increasingly widespread rumor, held that contested ground against serious challenge for well over a year. An unmated female alpha, Marcus repeated slowly, something uneasy stirring in his chest that he could not immediately name. Holding territory alone, without pack backing or bloodline claim? That's what the scouts report, Owen confirmed. Nobody seems entirely certain where she came from originally. The settlement itself is a mix of exiles and orphaned wolves from multiple packs, drawn together over roughly the past 2 years. They've earned a reputation as dangerous to underestimate. The Ashwood pack apparently tested them directly last year and retreated without engaging in open conflict. Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach at the mention of Ashwood, Sabrina's family pack, and the timeline Owen described. 2 years. Roughly the same span of time since the night of his selection ceremony, since the night Elena Voss had disappeared from the pack entirely, her absence discovered the following morning, and never fully explained to anyone outside his most trusted circle. He had told himself, in the aftermath of her disappearance, that she had simply needed distance, that she would return once the sharpest edges of her hurt had dulled with time. When months passed without any sign of her, he had allowed himself to believe, because the alternative felt too heavy to carry alongside his new political marriage, that she had found shelter with some distant relative, some corner of the world far removed from the pack, and the man who had chosen someone else in front of her. He had never once considered that she might have built something like this. "I want to see the full scouting report," Marcus said, his voice tighter than he intended. "Every detail, location, defenses, and especially anything more specific about this alpha holding the territory." Owen studied him for a moment, clearly noting the unusual intensity in Marcus's reaction to what should have been, on its surface, a fairly routine border resource issue. "Is there something specific concerning you about this situation?" Marcus hesitated, unwilling to voice the suspicion forming in his chest before he had any real confirmation to support it. "Just concerned about the resource impact on our southern hunting grounds," he said finally, though the excuse felt thin even to his own ears. "I want complete information before we decide how to respond." Owen nodded, accepting the explanation without further question, and left to gather the additional scouting details Marcus had requested. Once alone again, Marcus sat back in his chair, his mind racing through possibilities he had not allowed himself to consider in nearly 2 years. A lone female alpha, arriving in contested wilderness at almost exactly the same time Elena disappeared, building a fortified settlement from nothing but sheer determination and skill, earning a reputation for tactical brilliance that had made even established, powerful packs think twice before testing her claim directly. It sounded, in ways that made his chest tighten with something between hope and dread, exactly like something Elena would do. He thought of her training beside him in the fighting circle since childhood, always fierce, always determined, never willing to accept defeat as final when there remained any possible strategy left unexplored. He thought of the quiet strength she had carried even as a young girl, the way she had refused to let anyone see her cry after difficult losses, insisting always on rising again to try harder the next time. If anyone from his old pack could have survived alone in dangerous contested wilderness, could have built something defensible from nothing but stubborn will and tactical skill, it was Elena. The scouting report arrived on his desk 2 days later, more detailed than the initial summary Owen had provided. Marcus read through it slowly, his heart pounding harder with each additional detail that seemed to confirm his growing suspicion. A description of the settlement's defensive strategy during last year's confrontation with the Ashwood testing party matched, with striking precision, tactical principles Marcus remembered teaching Elena himself during their year's training together. Principles about using terrain and perceived numbers to deter conflict, rather than relying purely on physical force. And then, buried near the end of the report, a single detail that removed any remaining doubt. A scout, describing a brief encounter at the settlement's boundary during a routine reconnaissance mission, noted the Alpha's scent marker left on a boundary tree, distinctive enough that the scout had specifically flagged it as unusual, carrying a particular quality he could not quite place, but found oddly familiar. Marcus recognized the description immediately. He had grown up close enough to Elena to know her scent as intimately as his own, and even filtered through a scout's second-hand written description. Something in the report's careful detail struck him with absolute, bone-deep certainty. Elena Voss was alive. Elena Voss had survived 2 years alone in dangerous, contested wilderness. And Elena Voss had built, apparently through nothing but her own fierce determination and tactical brilliance, something that even established packs now hesitated to challenge directly. Marcus sat in his study, long after Owen had gone, the scouting report still open before him, and felt something shift deep in his chest that he had spent 2 years carefully suppressing beneath duty and political obligation, and the quiet, hollow routine of a marriage that had never truly become what he once hoped it might. He thought of the fire 2 years ago, of the moment Elena's expression had cracked just slightly before she forced it back into careful composure, of the guilt he had carried privately ever since, never fully addressed, never fully resolved. He understood, sitting alone in his study with dawn light beginning to filter through the window, that he could not simply file this report away and continue pretending the southern border situation was nothing more than a resource management concern. He needed to see this settlement himself. He needed to know, with absolute certainty, rather than second-hand scout reports, exactly what Elena had built in the 2 years since he watched her walk away from a fire that should have belonged to both of them. He rose from his desk as the first true light of morning broke over the horizon, already knowing, with a certainty that settled deep and unshakable in his chest, exactly where his next journey would take him. Elena caught the scent the moment it crossed her territory's northern boundary, and her whole body went rigid with a recognition so immediate and so complete that for a long, disorienting moment, she genuinely believed her mind must be playing some kind of cruel trick on her. 2 years had passed since she last caught that particular scent, carried on wind that smelled of a fire and a name that was not hers, and yet standing now at the edge of the settlement she had built entirely from her own determination, she recognized it instantly, unmistakably, impossible to confuse with anyone else in the world. Marcus. She stood frozen for several heartbeats, torn between disbelief and a fear she had not expected to feel this sharply, after 2 years of building a life that no longer depended on him for anything. Around her, the settlement continued its normal midday rhythm, wolves moving between shelters and hunting grounds, entirely unaware that the scent crossing their northern boundary belonged to anyone significant. Only Whisper, now fully grown and deeply attuned to Elena's moods after 2 years of close companionship, seemed to notice the sudden change in her posture, moving closer, with an alert, questioning tilt to his ears. Elena forced herself to breathe steadily, drawing on every ounce of the composure she had spent 2 years learning to project, even in the face of genuine danger. Whatever had brought Marcus to her territory's border, whatever he wanted, she would not meet him as the girl who had once waited desperately for his approval. She would meet him as the woman she had become, the alpha who had built something entirely her own from nothing but stubborn determination, and she would let that transformation speak for itself, before either of them exchanged a single word. She called Priya over quietly, explaining just enough to ensure the settlement would remain calm and prepared, without unnecessary alarm, and then she walked toward the northern boundary alone, her spine straight, her expression carefully neutral, though her heart pounded so hard she wondered if the sound might carry on the still afternoon air. She found him standing exactly at the boundary line, not crossing it, respecting the marked territory even before any confrontation could establish whether he was welcome to cross it at all. He had come alone, she noted immediately, without the escort of trackers or fighters that a genuine border dispute investigation would typically warrant. He wore simple traveling clothes rather than any formal alpha regalia, and standing there in the dappled afternoon light filtering through the trees, he looked, for one disorienting moment, almost exactly like the boy she had trained beside in the fighting circle so many years ago, before ceremonies and political marriages and fires that changed everything. Then he turned and saw her, and Elena watched something complicated pass across his face, surprise and relief, and something rawer beneath both, that he did not immediately try to hide. "Elena," he said, her name carrying a weight in his voice that told her, more clearly than any explanation could have, exactly how much uncertainty had brought him here. "Marcus," she answered, keeping her own voice carefully level, refusing to let 2 years of hard-won composure crack, simply because he stood close enough now that she could see every familiar detail of his face, older now, more tired around the eyes than she remembered, but unmistakably the same person whose choice had once broken something inside her she had needed 2 years of solitary struggle to rebuild. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the silence between them stretching heavy, with everything neither one seemed ready to address directly. Elena studied him carefully, noting the way his eyes moved past her briefly, taking in the visible edges of the settlement beyond, the defensive positioning, the clear signs of a functioning, organized community, rather than the desperate, scattered survival he had perhaps expected to find. "You built all this," he said finally, something like genuine wonder coloring his voice. "Alone." "Not alone," Elena corrected, unable to keep a note of pride from entering her own voice despite her determination to remain guarded. "Not for a long time now. I have people here who trust me, who chose to stay and build something with me, rather than simply survive day to day. We hold this territory together." Marcus nodded slowly, and Elena watched him absorb the correction, watched something shift behind his eyes as he processed the reality that stood before him, so different from whatever image he had likely carried in his mind during 2 years of uncertainty about what had become of her. "How did you find this place?" she asked, deciding it was better to address the practical question first, before either of them ventured into territory far more difficult to navigate. "This land sits well beyond your pack's normal boundaries." "Resource reports," Marcus admitted. "Our southern hunting grounds have grown thinner over the past year, and when I sent scouts to investigate, they discovered a settlement holding contested land nearby. A settlement, according to the reports, led by an unmated female alpha, who had somehow managed to hold this territory against every challenge thrown at her, including a serious attempt by the Ashwood pack." Elena's eyebrows rose slightly at the mention of Ashwood, and she watched Marcus's expression flicker at the reaction, some private tension crossing his face that she did not yet understand. "The reports mentioned details," Marcus continued, his voice growing quieter now, more careful, "tactical strategies, scent details, that made me suspect, before I ever arrived here, exactly who I would find." "And now you know for certain," Elena said, refusing to soften the moment for him, refusing to make this reunion easier than it deserved to be, after 2 years of silence between them. "Was that worth the journey? Confirming that the girl who walked away from your fire didn't simply disappear into the wilderness and die quietly somewhere, the way I imagine some part of you must have assumed." The words landed with more sharpness than she had fully intended, and she watched Marcus flinch slightly, absorbing the accusation without immediately arguing against it. I told myself you'd found shelter somewhere, he said quietly. With distant family, perhaps. I told myself that because the alternative, imagining you alone and struggling in dangerous wilderness because of a choice I made, was more than I could carry alongside everything else I was already carrying that year. Alongside your marriage, Elena said, the word landing between them like a stone dropped into still water. Yes, Marcus admitted, meeting her gaze directly, despite the visible difficulty of the admission. Alongside my marriage. Elena studied him for a long moment, searching his expression for any sign of the practiced political performance she remembered from that terrible night by the fire, the smooth confidence with which he had spoken Sabrina's name, without any visible hesitation. She found instead something rawer, more uncertain. A man who had clearly spent 2 years carrying weight, he had not expected the decision to cost him. Why are you actually here, Marcus? She asked finally, deciding that whatever answer he gave, she deserved to hear it stated plainly, rather than circling endlessly around the point. You didn't travel here alone, without escort, simply to confirm a resource dispute report. What do you actually want? Marcus was quiet for a long moment, and Elena watched him visibly gather himself, choosing his next words with obvious care. I don't fully know, he admitted finally, honesty evident in his tired expression. I told myself I came to assess a territorial dispute properly, to understand exactly what kind of settlement had established itself near our southern border. But the moment I confirmed it was you, Elena, I understood that was never the real reason I made this journey alone, rather than sending scouts to handle a straightforward resource negotiation. Then tell me the real reason, Elena said, her voice steady despite the way her chest had tightened at his admission. I needed to see you, Marcus said simply, the words carrying a weight that neither ceremony nor political calculation had ever taught him to disguise. I needed to know you were alive, that you were safe, that whatever I broke that night at the fire hadn't destroyed you completely. I've carried that guilt for 2 years, Elena, and I couldn't continue pretending it didn't matter, simply because pretending was easier than confronting what my choice actually cost. Elena felt something crack slightly in her carefully maintained composure, old grief rising unexpectedly alongside the strength she had spent 2 years building. She pushed it back down deliberately, refusing to let 2 years of hard-won independence dissolve simply because Marcus finally stood before her, admitting guilt she had needed, desperately, to hear acknowledged that terrible night by the fire, when no acknowledgement had come at all. I'm alive, she said finally, her voice steady again. I'm more than alive, Marcus. I built something here that belongs entirely to me, shaped by no council's political calculation, no bloodline expectation, nothing but my own choices, and the loyalty of people who chose to stand beside me freely. Whatever guilt you've carried these past 2 years, you don't need to carry it on my account any longer. I don't need your guilt. I built a life that doesn't require it. Marcus absorbed her words silently, something complicated moving across his face, and Elena watched him understand, perhaps for the first time truly understand, that the young woman who had once waited quietly at the edge of his fire for a name that never came, no longer existed in any form he might have hoped to find here. In her place stood someone forged entirely new, someone whose strength no longer depended in any way on his approval or his choices. I'm glad, Marcus said finally, and Elena heard genuine sincerity in the words, despite the obvious complexity of everything else churning beneath them. I'm glad you built something real here, Elena. You deserve that, more than anyone I've ever known. They stood together at the boundary line for a long moment afterward, neither quite ready to end the conversation, though neither seemed certain exactly what should come next. Elena felt the weight of 2 years pressing against the careful boundary she had built around her own heart, old feelings stirring in ways she had genuinely believed. Until this exact moment, she had fully moved beyond. You should go, she said finally, though the words carried less certainty than she intended. Whatever brought you here, whatever you needed to confirm or resolve, I imagine you've found it now. Your pack and your wife will be waiting for your return. Marcus's expression tightened slightly at the mention of Sabrina, something guarded passing behind his eyes, that Elena noted, but did not immediately press. Yes, he said finally, though something in his voice suggested the answer carried more complication than the simple word implied. I should return. He turned to leave, then paused, looking back at her, with an expression Elena could not fully read, somewhere between longing and careful restraint. "Would it be acceptable," he asked quietly, "if I returned sometime, simply to see that you and your settlement remain well, not as any kind of political negotiation, simply as someone who cares whether you're safe?" Elena hesitated, every instinct honed over 2 years of careful self-protection, warning her against the vulnerability such an arrangement might invite back into a life she had built specifically to no longer depend on him for anything at all. But beneath that caution, something else stirred too, something she had not expected to feel again after 2 years. Curiosity, perhaps, or the faint, dangerous pull of unfinished history neither of them had ever properly resolved. "We'll see," she said finally, refusing to promise more than she was genuinely prepared to offer. "This is still my territory, Marcus. Whatever happens between us going forward, that fact doesn't change." "Understood," Marcus said, something almost like a genuine smile touching his tired face for the first time since he had arrived. "Your territory, your terms. I wouldn't expect anything else from you now." He turned and walked back into the trees, disappearing from sight, and Elena stood alone at the boundary for a long time afterward, her heart still pounding, old feelings and hard-won independence, tangled together in a way she suspected would take considerable time to fully sort through. Whisper padded up beside her quietly, pressing close against her side the way he had done since she first freed him from a trapper's snare 2 years earlier, and Elena rested a hand against his fur, grateful for the steady, uncomplicated loyalty he offered, even as everything else in her chest felt suddenly, dangerously uncertain again. 2 years of careful, hard-won distance, and one conversation at a boundary line had already begun to complicate everything she thought she had settled permanently within her own heart. Marcus returned to the boundary of Elena's territory 11 days after their first conversation, and this time, Elena felt the familiar scent crossing her northern border without the same overwhelming shock that had frozen her the first time. She had, in some quiet corner of her mind she was reluctant to fully examine, been expecting him, counting the days, without consciously admitting to herself that she was counting them at all. She met him again at the boundary, though this time she brought a small offering of preserved meat and dried herbs, a gesture that fell somewhere between hospitality and cautious diplomacy, between 2 territories that technically remained separate holdings. Marcus accepted it with visible surprise, and Elena watched him understand, without her needing to explain directly, that the gesture represented something significant, a small crack opening in the careful wall she had built around herself during their first difficult conversation. They walked together along the boundary that afternoon, not crossing fully into either territory, remaining in the neutral space between 2 claims that neither of them named directly, but both clearly understood. Marcus asked about her settlement, genuine curiosity evident in his questions, and Elena found herself explaining more than she had initially intended, describing Nolan's skill as a hunter, Priya's steady practical leadership, the slow, difficult work of building trust among a group of wolves, who had each arrived carrying their own history of loss and betrayal. "You built something I never could have built within my own pack," Marcus admitted quietly as they walked, something like genuine admiration coloring his voice. "Everything within my territory operates according to structures that existed before I was ever born. Bloodline expectations, political alliances, traditions no one questions, simply because they've always existed. What you've built here operates on something entirely different." "Earned loyalty," Elena said simply. "Not inherited authority." "Yes," Marcus agreed, and something in his tone suggested the comparison struck deeper than simple admiration, touching perhaps on frustrations he had carried privately throughout his own 2 years, leading a pack whose expectations he had never fully chosen for himself. Elena studied him carefully as they walked, noting the tension that seemed to settle permanently into his shoulders whenever conversation drifted anywhere near the subject of his own pack's leadership, and she found herself, despite every instinct warning her against renewed emotional investment in his life, genuinely curious about what those 2 years had actually cost him. "Tell me about your marriage," she said finally, deciding directness served her better than careful avoidance of a subject that clearly weighed on him, regardless of whether she asked about it openly. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, and Elena watched him consider how honestly to answer, weighing loyalty to a wife he shared a household with, against the genuine need, evident in his tired expression, to speak plainly about a situation he had likely never discussed openly with anyone before. It was never built on anything real, he admitted finally. Sabrina and I both understood, from the very beginning, that our marriage served political purposes rather than genuine connection. I told myself, in the beginning, that connection might grow naturally over time if we simply gave it enough patience. It hasn't grown, Elena. If anything, we've grown further apart with each passing month, until our shared house feels less like a home and more like two people navigating around each other's presence out of simple obligation. Elena felt a complicated tangle of emotions at his admission, old hurt mixing uncomfortably with something that felt uncomfortably close to hope, an emotion she immediately distrusted, given everything she had already sacrificed once before believing in a future with him that never materialized. That doesn't change what happened at the fire, she said carefully, refusing to let his unhappiness in his current marriage soften her memory of the night he had chosen someone else in front of an entire pack. Whatever your marriage has become since then, the choice you made that night was still yours. You chose political alliance over whatever existed between us. I don't need you to regret that choice now simply because the alliance itself hasn't delivered the happiness you expected. I know, Marcus said quietly, absorbing her words without argument. I'm not asking you to forgive that choice, Elena. I understand I don't have any right to ask that of you. I'm simply trying to be honest with you now, in ways I perhaps should have been honest with myself long before that fire ever burned. They walked in silence for a while after that, the weight of everything unspoken settling comfortably enough between them that Elena found herself, somewhat to her own surprise, not entirely uncomfortable with the quiet. Something had shifted since their first conversation, a careful, tentative trust beginning to rebuild itself in small increments, though Elena remained deliberately cautious about how much space she allowed that trust to occupy. Over the following weeks, Marcus's visits became a quiet, unspoken rhythm, neither of them fully acknowledged aloud, though both of them, Elena suspected, understood exactly what those regular visits had begun to mean. He came perhaps once every 10 days, always alone, always respecting the boundary line, unless Elena explicitly invited him further into her territory, which she began to do gradually, first allowing him to meet Priya and Nolan, eventually inviting him to share a meal with her settlement's community around their evening fire. Her people, she noticed, remained understandably wary of him at first, several of them carrying their own histories of mistreatment by established pack alphas that made Marcus's presence within their carefully built sanctuary feel like an unwelcome intrusion. But Marcus, to his credit, approached those early tense interactions with genuine humility, rather than the assumed authority Elena remembered from his role leading his own pack, listening carefully to Nolan's story of unjust exile, offering practical advice about hunting techniques without ever attempting to assert leadership over a settlement that was not his to command. Slowly, gradually, the wariness within her settlement began to soften into something closer to cautious acceptance, and Elena found herself, watching Marcus sit comfortably among her people around the evening fire, one particular evening, sharing a story about his own difficult early years as a young alpha, feeling something warm and dangerous stirring in her chest, that she recognized immediately as the same feeling she had spent 2 years believing she had permanently buried. She confronted that feeling directly one evening, after Marcus had returned to his own territory, sitting alone by the dying embers of the settlement's fire, while most of her people had already retired for the night. Priya found her there, settling down beside her with the quiet, perceptive understanding that had made her such a valuable presence within their community. "You're falling for him again," Priya said gently. Not a question, but a simple, careful observation. Elena did not immediately deny it, staring instead into the glowing embers as she considered how to answer honestly. "I don't want to be," she admitted finally. "I spent 2 years building something entirely my own, something that doesn't depend on him for its worth or its stability. I don't want to risk all of that simply because he shows up now, admitting regret 2 years too late." "Does wanting something risky make it automatically wrong to want it?" Priya asked, her tone gentle, but genuinely curious rather than judgmental. Elena considered the question carefully. "He's still married," she said finally. "Whatever exists between us now, whatever might have existed years ago before that fire, he's still bound to Sabrina Cole through a political alliance. Neither of us has any right to unravel, simply because we've discovered old feelings haven't fully disappeared." "That's true," Priya agreed simply. But it's also true that you've built enough strength here, Elena, that whatever happens between you and Marcus going forward, you're no longer the same person waiting quietly at the edge of a fire for someone else to decide your future. If something develops between you two now, it will develop on your terms, on ground you built with your own hands, not on ground handed to you by his pack's political calculations. Elena absorbed her friend's words slowly, recognizing the truth in them even as uncertainty continued churning in her chest. She was no longer the girl who had walked away from that fire 2 years ago, uncertain and heartbroken, with nothing but a small bundle of supplies and a determination to survive one more day. Whatever happened next between herself and Marcus, whatever complicated tangle of old feelings and unresolved history continued to develop between their two territories, she understood clearly that she would face it as the alpha she had become, not the young woman she had once been. But complications, she knew, rarely resolved themselves simply because one person had grown strong enough to face them directly. Marcus remained married. His pack remained bound by political alliances that had nothing to do with genuine feeling, and everything to do with power and resource security. Whatever developed between Elena and Marcus going forward would eventually collide with those realities, and Elena understood, sitting alone by her dying fire with Priya's steady presence beside her, that when that collision finally came, it would test everything she had built here far more seriously than any rival pack's testing patrol ever had. She was ready for that test, she told herself, staring into the embers as the fire slowly burned down toward morning. She had survived worse. She had built an entire settlement from nothing but stubborn will and tactical skill. Whatever complicated future waited ahead, involving Marcus and his marriage, and the delicate politics binding two entirely different territories together, Elena intended to face it exactly the way she had faced every challenge since walking away from that first fire 2 years ago. On her own terms, and never, ever alone. Sabrina Cole confronted Marcus in their shared study on a cold evening, nearly 3 months after his first visit to Elena's territory, and the fury in her voice carried none of the careful, practiced composure she had maintained throughout every public appearance during their 2 years of marriage. "You think I haven't noticed the pattern of your absences?" she demanded, throwing a folded piece of parchment onto the desk between them. A report Marcus recognized immediately as belonging to her own personal tracker. Someone she had apparently assigned, without his knowledge, to monitor his movements over recent months. Every 10 days, disappearing alone toward the southern border, returning hours later without any formal report to justify the journey. "I had you followed, Marcus. I know exactly where you've been going, and I know exactly who you've been seeing." Marcus felt his stomach drop, though he forced himself to remain outwardly calm, understanding that panic now would only confirm every suspicion Sabrina had clearly already formed. "The southern settlement represents a legitimate territorial concern," he said carefully. "I've been monitoring the situation personally, given its potential impact on our hunting grounds." "Don't insult me with that explanation," Sabrina snapped, her composure cracking further with each word. "My tracker's report describes considerably more than professional territorial monitoring, Marcus. Shared meals, extended conversations at the boundary line, a clear pattern of personal visits to a woman my own family recognizes by name, Elena Voss. The same Elena Voss who disappeared from your pack the very night you selected me instead of her." The room fell into tense, heavy silence, and Marcus understood there was no longer any point maintaining the pretense he had been carefully constructing for months. "Yes," he admitted finally, "Elena Voss is alive, and yes, I've been visiting her territory. But nothing has happened between us that violates the terms of our marriage, Sabrina. I've been honest with you about that, even if I haven't been transparent about the visits themselves." "Nothing has happened," Sabrina repeated, disbelief and anger tangled together in her voice. "Marcus, I've watched you these past 2 years. I've watched you go through the motions of this marriage, with all the enthusiasm of a man serving an unwanted obligation. I understand exactly why. Because I feel precisely the same way about our arrangement. But watching you find genuine warmth with someone else, even if that warmth hasn't yet crossed into anything more explicit, is not something I'm prepared to simply accept without consequence." Marcus studied his wife carefully, searching for the particular quality of hurt beneath her anger, and found, somewhat to his surprise, something that looked less like wounded love and more like wounded pride. The particular fury of someone whose carefully calculated political arrangement had begun visibly unraveling in ways that threatened her family's standing, rather than her personal heart. "What consequence are you considering?" he asked directly, deciding that whatever came next deserved plain, honest confrontation, rather than continued careful maneuvering around the actual stakes involved. Sabrina's expression sharpened with calculated intent. "My family didn't arrange this marriage simply to watch you humiliate us by courting some exiled wolf who couldn't even hold her place within her own original pack. If you continue these visits, Marcus, I will bring this matter before the Elder Council myself, framed exactly as it deserves to be framed. An alpha neglecting his political obligations and his marriage vows to pursue a relationship with a woman who abandoned her own pack, rather than accept her alpha's decision gracefully. The council will not look favorably on that narrative, and neither will my family's allies. You risk considerably more than simple personal embarrassment if this continues. You'd risk open conflict between our packs, simply to punish me for visiting a neighboring territory?" Marcus asked, though he understood, even as he spoke the words, that Sabrina's threat carried real, dangerous weight behind it. "I'd risk considerably more than that to protect my family's standing," Sabrina answered coldly. "And you should understand clearly, Marcus, that framing this as some kind of unfair punishment against you conveniently ignores the fact that you're the one who chose to pursue this situation, despite knowing exactly what consequences it might invite. If war comes from this, the responsibility rests with your choices, not mine." She left the study without waiting for his response, and Marcus sat alone afterward for a long time, understanding with growing dread that Sabrina's threat was not simple emotional posturing. She had the political connections and family influence to genuinely bring this situation before the Elder Council, to frame the narrative exactly as damagingly as she had threatened, and depending on how the council received that framing, the consequences might extend far beyond his own personal reputation, potentially threatening the fragile peace between his pack and Sabrina's politically powerful family. He understood, sitting alone in the cold study, that he needed to warn Elena immediately, before Sabrina's tracker, or the wider political machinery she controlled, had any opportunity to escalate this situation without Elena's knowledge or preparation. He traveled to her boundary the following morning, arriving earlier than his usual visits, and moving with an urgency that Elena noticed immediately when she met him at the boundary line. "Something's wrong," she said, before he could even speak, reading the tension in his posture, with the same sharp attentiveness that had kept her settlement safe through countless earlier threats. Marcus explained the confrontation quickly, laying out Sabrina's discovery and her explicit threat without softening any of the dangerous implications involved. Elena listened silently, her expression growing increasingly guarded as he spoke, and when he finished, she was quiet for a long moment, processing everything he had told her. "She could genuinely bring this before the Elder Council?" Elena asked finally, her voice carefully controlled despite the obvious weight of the question. "Yes," Marcus admitted, "and given her family's political influence, the council would likely take the accusation seriously, regardless of how unfairly it might be framed. This could escalate into genuine conflict between our territories, Elena, not because either of us wants that outcome, but because Sabrina's family has both the motivation and the connections to push it in that direction if they believe their standing has been publicly threatened." Elena absorbed this information with the same careful, strategic calculation she had applied to every serious threat her settlement had faced over the past 2 years, and Marcus watched her mind working through possible responses, weighing risks and consequences with the sharp, practical clarity that had kept her people safe through every previous confrontation. "I have 2 choices, as I understand it," she said finally. "I could ask you to stop visiting entirely, protect both our territories from unnecessary conflict, by simply ending whatever has been developing between us before it causes real damage. Or I could refuse to retreat from something I've chosen freely, and force this situation toward whatever resolution it eventually needs to reach, regardless of the risk involved." "I won't ask you to choose either option," Marcus said quietly. "This is your decision to make, Elena, not mine. Whatever risk comes from continuing this, I'll face it alongside you. But I understand if protecting your settlement's safety matters more than protecting whatever exists between us." Elena was quiet for a long moment, staring out over the boundary line toward the territory she had built with nothing but her own determination and the loyalty of people who had chosen to stand beside her freely. Marcus watched her carefully, understanding that whatever she decided in this moment would likely determine the entire trajectory of both their futures, and he forced himself to remain patient, refusing to press her toward any particular answer. "I spent 2 years building something entirely my own," Elena said finally, her voice steady and clear despite the obvious weight of the decision. "I refuse to spend the rest of my life retreating from every threat, simply because retreating feels safer than standing my ground. If Sabrina wants to bring this before the Elder Council, then let her. I won't hide, and I won't pretend to be ashamed of choices I've made freely, choices that hurt no one except perhaps a marriage that was never built on anything real to begin with." "This could mean genuine conflict, Elena," Marcus said carefully, wanting to ensure she fully understood the stakes before committing to this path. Not simply political embarrassment, actual conflict between territories, potentially costing lives on both sides. "I understand the risk," Elena said, meeting his gaze directly. "But Marcus, I also understand something else clearly now, something I don't think I fully understood until this exact moment. I'm not willing to build my entire life around avoiding conflict simply because conflict is frightening. I built this settlement by refusing to retreat from every threat that challenged my claim. I won't abandon that principle now simply because this particular threat happens to involve my own heart, rather than contested hunting ground." Marcus felt something complicated rise in his chest at her words, admiration tangled together with genuine fear for what consequences this decision might invite for both of them. "Then we face it together," he said quietly. "Whatever comes from this, Elena, I won't let you face the consequences alone." "I know," Elena said, something softer entering her voice, for the first time since he had arrived with the urgent news of Sabrina's discovery. "That's precisely why I'm willing to risk this at all." They stood together at the boundary line for a long moment afterward, both of them understanding that whatever peaceful uncertainty had existed between their two territories over the past 3 months had now shifted into something considerably more urgent, a genuine confrontation building on the horizon that neither of them could fully predict or control. Word of Sabrina's discovery, and her explicit threat to bring the matter before the Elder Council, spread through both territories faster than either Elena or Marcus anticipated. Within a week, Elena's settlement buzzed with tense speculation about what genuine conflict with an established, politically powerful pack might mean for their fragile, hard-won community. Priya organized additional defensive preparations without needing to be asked. Nolan and Callum began strengthening the boundary fortifications that had held against previous threats, and the entire settlement settled into the particular quiet, focused tension that Elena recognized from every serious challenge her people had faced together over the past 2 years. She gathered her closest advisors around the settlement's central fire on the evening before Marcus expected Sabrina to formally bring her accusation before the Elder Council, laying out everything at stake with the same honest, direct communication that had earned her people's trust from the very beginning of their community. "This could mean real conflict," she told them plainly. "I won't pretend otherwise, and I won't ask any of you to accept that risk without full understanding of what it might cost. If any of you believe retreating from this situation, distancing our settlement from Marcus, and whatever political fallout Sabrina intends to create, represents the wiser path, I want to hear that honestly." Nolan spoke first, his expression fierce despite the obvious weight of the decision. "We've faced worse than political threats from an established pack before," he said. "We held this ground against 15 trained fighters over a year ago. We can hold it against council politics too, if it comes to that." Priya nodded her agreement, and around the fire, one by one, the rest of Elena's people voiced similar determination, refusing to abandon the community they had built, simply because the threat now wore political, rather than physical form. Elena felt something steady settle deep in her chest, watching her people commit themselves to standing beside her, regardless of the risk involved, and she understood, more clearly than ever before, exactly what she had built here over the past 2 years. Not simply a defensible territory, not simply a functioning settlement capable of holding contested ground. She had built genuine loyalty, freely given, strong enough to weather whatever storm Sabrina Cole's political machinery might attempt to unleash against them. Whatever the Elder Council decided in the coming days, Elena understood, sitting among her people around the fire that had become the true heart of everything she had built here, she would face the outcome exactly as she had faced every challenge before it. Standing firmly on ground she had claimed entirely for herself, surrounded by people who had chosen, freely and completely, to stand beside her. The Elder Council chamber fell completely silent the moment Marcus Kane rose from his seat, and Sabrina Cole, seated across the room beside her father and the assembled representatives of the Ashwood pack, watched with visible confusion as he began speaking before the council had even formally called for his statement. "I ask to address this council directly," Marcus said, his voice carrying clearly through the tense, crowded chamber, "because I refuse to let this matter proceed as a whispered scandal, framed carefully by someone else's chosen narrative. I intend to speak the full truth plainly, and let the council judge the situation with complete information, rather than partial accusation." The senior elder, an aging wolf named Ingrid who had presided over council matters for longer than Marcus had been alive, gestured for him to continue, her expression carefully neutral, despite the obvious tension crackling through the assembled representatives. "2 years ago," Marcus began, "I selected Sabrina Cole as my mate during a formal ceremony before my entire pack. I made that choice, under significant pressure, from this very council, understanding it as necessary to secure a political alliance between our territories. I did not make that choice out of genuine personal connection, and I believe Sabrina herself would confirm that our marriage has never developed into anything beyond a practical arrangement. Neither of us has found genuine fulfillment within." Sabrina's expression tightened, though she did not immediately interrupt, apparently waiting to see exactly where Marcus intended to take this unexpected admission. "On the same night I made that choice," Marcus continued, "a woman I had grown up alongside, someone the entire pack had reasonably expected me to select instead, left our territory, rather than remain, and watch a future she had believed belonged to her, be handed instead to someone else. She survived 2 years alone in dangerous wilderness, eventually building a settlement that this council itself has already discussed in the context of southern border disputes, a settlement that has proven itself capable of holding contested ground against serious challenge, including a testing attempt from the Ashwood pack itself." Murmurs rippled through the assembled council members at this revelation, several of them exchanging glances that suggested the earlier reports about the mysterious settlement's leadership had already reached wider circulation than Marcus had realized. "I have visited that settlement," Marcus said plainly, refusing to let any careful ambiguity soften the admission. "I have spoken with Elena Voss, and I have come to understand, clearly and completely, that the alliance my marriage to Sabrina Cole represents has never served either of us well, built as it was on political calculation, rather than genuine partnership. I am formally requesting this council dissolve our union, not because of any wrongdoing on Sabrina's part, but because continuing a marriage neither of us finds meaningful serves no genuine purpose for either our packs or ourselves." Sabrina rose from her seat then, her composure fully restored now, cold and calculating. "This council should understand clearly," she said, "that my husband is attempting to dissolve our alliance in order to pursue a relationship with a woman who abandoned her own pack, rather than accept its alpha's decision with any dignity." "I did accept the decision with dignity," Marcus said before the council could respond, turning to face Sabrina directly. "I never once suggested Elena reacted improperly to my choice that night, Sabrina. She walked away quietly, without scene, without protest, and built an entirely new life, through nothing but her own strength and determination. If anything, her response to that painful night demonstrates considerably more dignity than I demonstrated by allowing political pressure to override my own honest judgment about where genuine connection actually existed." Ingrid raised a hand, calling the chamber back to order before the exchange could escalate further. "The council will consider this request for formal dissolution," she said. "However, given the unusual circumstances involved, including the settlement's demonstrated territorial legitimacy, that this very council has already implicitly recognized through its handling of related border disputes, I believe it would serve this matter well to hear directly from the woman at the center of these events, if she is willing to appear before us." The chamber fell silent again, and Marcus felt his chest tighten with uncertainty. He had not expected the council to request Elena's direct presence, had not prepared her for the possibility that she might need to appear before the very political body whose pressure had originally forced his impossible choice 2 years earlier. But when the chamber doors opened 3 days later, following a formal invitation carried by council messenger, Elena Voss walked into the Elder Council chamber, with the same steady, unshaken composure she had carried through every serious challenge her settlement had faced over the past 2 years. She wore simple, practical clothing rather than any formal court dress, her posture confident and unhurried, and Marcus watched several council members exchange surprised glances at the quiet authority she projected, despite holding no formal recognized rank within the established pack hierarchy. "You wish to hear from me directly," Elena said, addressing the assembled council without waiting for formal introduction, her voice carrying clearly through the tense chamber. "I'll speak plainly then, and let you judge my words as you see fit." Ingrid nodded, gesturing for her to continue. 2 years ago, Elena said, I left my pack rather than remain, and watch a future I had believed belonged to me, handed instead to someone else. I did not leave out of weakness. I left because I understood, with absolute clarity, that remaining would mean living the rest of my life inside a wound this council's political pressure had helped create, and I refused to accept that fate, simply because tradition expected me to accept it gracefully. She paused, letting her words settle through the chamber before continuing. I built a settlement from nothing but my own 2 hands, and the loyalty of people who chose freely to stand beside me. I have held contested territory against serious challenge, including a testing attempt from Sabrina Cole's own family pack. I did not build any of that, seeking Marcus Kane's attention or approval. I built it because I refused to accept that my worth depended entirely on whether one man chose me over someone else. Marcus watched her carefully, pride and admiration mixing together in his chest as she spoke, refusing to soften her truth for the sake of political comfort, even while standing before the very council, whose judgment might determine the future of everything he hoped for between them. Marcus began visiting my territory some months ago, Elena continued. What developed between us since then developed slowly, honestly, and entirely without any intention of harming Sabrina Cole or the alliance her marriage represents. I understand her anger at discovering those visits. I would likely feel similarly threatened in her position. But I refuse to accept the framing that my choices, or Marcus's honest admission that his marriage never became what either he or Sabrina hoped it might, represent some kind of scandal deserving council punishment. Sometimes political arrangements simply fail to become genuine partnerships, regardless of how carefully they were originally calculated. That failure belongs to no single person's fault. The chamber remained quiet for a long moment after she finished speaking, and Marcus watched the assembled elders exchange careful glances, weighing everything they had heard against the political complexities involved in this unusual situation. Finally, Ingrid spoke again, her voice carrying the weight of considered judgment. This council recognizes that political marriages, however carefully calculated, cannot be forced into genuine success through simple decree. We further recognize, she continued, glancing toward the assembled Ashwood representatives, that the settlement Elena Voss has built represents legitimate territorial claim, earned through demonstrated capability, rather than granted through bloodline or political favor, a form of legitimacy this council has historically been slow to properly acknowledge. She paused, letting her words settle, before delivering the council's final judgment. This council grants the formal dissolution of the union between Marcus Kane and Sabrina Cole, recognizing that continued political alliance can be pursued through other diplomatic means that do not require an unhappy marriage to sustain them. Furthermore, this council formally recognizes Elena Voss's settlement as a legitimate independent territory, entitled to the same protections and considerations extended to any established pack within our jurisdiction. Sabrina's expression tightened with visible frustration, though she said nothing further, apparently understanding that further protest would gain little against the council's formal ruling. She rose and left the chamber without another word, her father and the Ashwood representatives following closely behind her, and Marcus felt the tension that had gripped his chest for days finally begin to ease. Elena remained standing before the council, and Marcus watched her carefully as the chamber began to empty around them, uncertain exactly what would happen next between them, now that the immediate political crisis had resolved itself. He crossed the chamber to stand before her once the room had mostly cleared, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke, the weight of everything that had happened over the past 2 years settling between them in the sudden quiet. I'm not asking you to return to my pack, Marcus said finally, choosing his words with careful deliberation. I understand that everything you built, everything you are now, exists entirely separate from my territory, built through your own strength rather than anything I could offer you. I would never ask you to abandon that for my sake. Then what are you asking? Elena said, though something in her expression suggested she already suspected the answer. I'm asking if I might join your settlement, Marcus said quietly, not as an alpha claiming a mate, not bringing any authority or expectation that my former rank should grant me special standing among your people. I'm asking to earn a place there, the same way everyone else in your settlement earned theirs, through demonstrated loyalty rather than inherited claim. Elena studied him for a long moment, and Marcus understood clearly that whatever she decided now would determine everything that came next between them. My people won't simply accept you because I ask them to, she said finally. You'll need to earn their trust the same way Nolan and Priya and Callum earned mine, through action rather than title. I understand, Marcus said. I'm prepared for that. 3 weeks later, Marcus Kane knelt before the gathered wolves of Elena's settlement around their central fire, having spent that time proving himself through honest labor, careful humility, and genuine willingness to learn from people who had built something he had spent his entire life assuming could only exist through inherited bloodline authority. He knelt not as an alpha claiming rightful place through rank or political calculation, but as someone asking, plainly and honestly, to be trusted by people who owed him nothing, simply because of who he had once been. Elena watched from beside the fire as her people, one by one, nodded their acceptance, understanding exactly what this moment represented, after everything they had all survived together to reach it. Nolan clasped Marcus's shoulder with genuine warmth. Priya offered a small, approving smile. Whisper, ever perceptive, padded forward to press against Marcus's side, with the same easy acceptance he had once offered Elena on her very first, uncertain night alone in the wilderness. Later that evening, once the settlement had settled into quiet celebration around the fire, Elena found Marcus standing at the edge of the gorge, looking out over territory that belonged entirely to her, built through nothing but her own stubborn determination and the loyalty of people who had chosen to stand beside her freely. This is your territory, Marcus said quietly as she joined him. Your terms, exactly as you always insisted. Yes, Elena agreed, something warm and steady settling in her chest as she looked out over the land she had claimed 2 years earlier, alone and heartbroken, uncertain whether she would survive even one more day in unfamiliar wilderness. And whatever comes next, Marcus, it will remain that way. You're welcome here now, earned rather than granted. But this settlement will always belong to the people who built it together, not to any single alpha's inherited authority. I wouldn't want it any other way, Marcus said, and Elena heard genuine sincerity in his voice, the honest humility of someone who had finally understood, after everything they had both survived, exactly what genuine partnership required. They stood together at the edge of the gorge as the fire's warm light flickered behind them, the settlement's quiet celebration continuing without them for a while longer, and Elena felt, for the first time since that terrible night 2 years ago when a fire had once broken something inside her chest, that she had finally found something whole again. Not because Marcus had finally chosen her, though he had, but because she had first chosen herself, built an entire life through her own strength and determination, and only then, standing firmly on ground she had claimed entirely for herself, allowed him back into a future that would always, from this moment forward, remain built on her own unshakable terms.